Hi, I'm so glad to see you. I'm Nicole Wallach, and I direct the undergraduate writing program at Columbia University. I'm one of two vice presidents of the WPA Metro affiliate, and it's my great privilege today to introduce our plenary speaker for this afternoon, lunchtime, Susan Miller Cochran. Susan Miller Cochran is Associate Professor of English at North Carolina State University in Raleigh, North Carolina, where she's directed the first-year writing program since 2006. She received her master's in teaching English as a second language and her doctorate in Ret Comp and linguistics from Arizona State University. Professor Miller Cochran is a prolific writer and researcher. Wouldn't believe the depth and breadth of this CV. You can go see it. It's amazing. And the range of her work explores the ever more frequent intersections among technology, second language teaching, and writing program administration. Her many books, articles, conference papers, invited talks, workshops, and research grants ask us to test our fundamental assumptions about research, collaboration, classroom instruction, and institutional cultures. Her edited collection of essays with Rochelle Rodrigo, Rhetorically Rethinking Usability, from Hampton Press, 2009, features research that explores how the concept of usability has been rethought in the context of rhetoric and composition teaching, and how ideas about usability shape our theoretical and pedagogical approaches to course design, notions of disability, universality, and documentation styles. It's really quite an amazing and timely collection. Her most recent books also include, just published in the last couple of months, I think, right? The Wadsworth Cengage Keys for Writers with Anne Rames, and the Wadsworth Guide to Research with Rochelle Rodrigo. Across her work, Susan often asks some version of the questions: whose perspective is being left out of a given idea about teaching or learning writing? What do we have to acknowledge about our own experiences and those of our students or our colleagues in order for them to participate richly in the cultures of writing we're trying to create and to sustain? We can hear these questions reverberate in her review essay in College Composition and Communication from 2011, an essay called Beyond Typical Ideas of Writing, Developing a Diverse Understanding of Writers, Writing, and Writing Instruction. And I want to read you a bit from the beginning, which includes this meditation. You write. My curriculum vitae is a snapshot of what could be seen as a disjointed academic career. A bachelor's degree in literature, a master's in teaching English as a second language, a thesis focusing on syntactic structures of Indonesian and English, a dissertation focusing on distance learning, teaching experience in adult education, a community college, and a large public research universities. One way of explaining my background is to label myself a generalist. Another defense might be to focus on my role as a writing program administrator who needs to be familiar with a variety of contexts for teaching writing. A more satisfying way to look at it, though, has been to focus on how these different aspects of my background and academic training can inform each other. For example, I always read scholarship in rhetoric and composition through the lens of my linguistic training, and my perspectives on writing and administration will always be informed by having had my first full-time teaching position at a community college. The more time I spend in the field of rhetoric and composition, the more I realize that many others in this field feel the same way I do. And I have to say that really resonates certainly for me, and I think many others here. I find it moving and heartening to remember the value of the unexpected shifts in our professional lives, and that each layer in the palimpsest of our professional identities is still available to draw on in our work as teachers, researchers, writers, and administrators. It is possible also to discern in this passage a recognition of how often still WPAs and teachers and graduate students in our profession are required to make our work legible to those outside of our programs and our discipline. This issue is particularly timely given that 75% of the academic labor force is being done by faculty in non-tenure track, part and full-time positions who are often literally rendered invisible to their colleagues, if not to their many students. I'm eager now to turn to our guest and to her talk today, The Persistence of Contingency, Rethinking Our Practices, Reshaping Our Futures. Please join me in welcoming Susan Miller Cochran.
Thank you so much, Nicole, and that's such a gracious introduction. And I'm really honored to be here with you all today. I'm just sad that I get to look out over the Hudson while you guys all have to look at me, unfortunately. It's such a beautiful view out that direction and such a lovely location. So thank you again for having me. And I'm also humbled by knowing that so many of you in this audience have written about, studied, served on committees dealing with the issues that I'm talking about today. And in some ways I feel like, at least from the beginning, I'm going to be reporting on some of the work that you all have done. And so I'm very aware that some of the work that I'm going to be talking about builds on things that have come before. But what I want to do today is to look at some of the historical trends that I feel shape where we find ourselves today in composition studies, and to explore some of our current practices, specifically our hiring practices, and the working conditions in our writing programs, and then discuss what we might do and what we might advocate for in our own programs to try to create the best kinds of working conditions for our faculty. And I want to give just a little bit of context. Nicole said a little bit about what my institutional background is, but much of what I'm going to be talking about today is informed by the fact that right now I direct a writing program that serves around 4,500 to 5,000 students a year who come through first-year writing. And all of those sections, about 75% are taught by non-tenure track faculty. The rest are taught by graduate students. But for the size of our institution, we have a relatively small graduate program in English. NC State is primarily known more for engineering and technology and the sciences, and our graduate programs in the humanities tend to be a little bit smaller. But we do have a really large and robust non-tenure track faculty in my program, and it's a faculty that I'm really proud to work with. And they're wonderful colleagues, and they inform the work that I do all of the time. But I came to NC State from Mesa Community College, which is part of the Maricopa Community College District in Arizona. There are 10 campuses in the Maricopa District. Mesa is the largest, and we had at the time I was there, around 28,000 students just at that campus. And in our English department, we had usually somewhere between 100 and 150 faculty teaching at any given time. And of those, around 35 to 40 of us were tenure track. So you can kind of get the picture of how many non-tenure track faculty we had working there. None of them were full-time, because it was a district policy that you couldn't hire someone over what would have been considered 75% effort, because then you have to pay them benefits. They had no offices. They were displaced. I mean, it's very much what Nicole is describing in terms of faculty who are literally rendered invisible to the institution and to their colleagues. So this is something that has become of increasing importance to me, because I'd like to see our faculty who are doing such good work in our programs get the kinds of working conditions and the recognition that they deserve. It's a little bit of a downer topic, though. Usually I feel like I'm talking about things that are a little more inspiring, but I will try to end on a positive note, I promise, with solutions and suggestions for what we can do. But first, I'm gonna ask you guys to do a little work, because one thing I have noticed in this group is that you all don't mind talking a little, which is great. So, can you guys read the screen up here? Okay, all right, so I'm just gonna ask you to talk about this at your table. And the tables are kind of large, so if you just wanna turn to your neighbor and share a little bit, I'm just gonna give you 1 or 2 minutes. But what I'd like you to do is to talk about what labels, job titles, or terms you associate with faculty positions that are not on the tenure track. You could list terms and titles, and then maybe describe a little bit what those positions look like. For example, at NC State, our non-tenure track faculty are called lecturers, and we have different tiers of lecturers. But what kinds of terms, labels, job titles do you associate with non-tenure track or contingent faculty? I'll give you guys a minute to talk about that. Okay, I'm gonna ask you to bring your attention back to the larger group. I'd like to hear some of the terms that came up at your tables if y'all don't mind. Just kind of call some of the things out that you talked about. Lecturer? Fellow, okay. Instructor. Freelance professors. Nice. Freeway flyer, yep. I have experienced that myself. Adjunct. Rhodes Scholar. Nice. Yeah, okay.
Road writing band.
Teaching assistants, yeah. Road writing band. Others? Associate. Like what, would it be like a teaching associate? Or, okay. We have that, I'm glad you said that because I forgot we also at NC State have teaching professors. Sometimes they're teaching associate professors, which is what reminded me of that. But there's a distinction made between, I guess, a just normal professor and a teaching professor, which then makes me think that the other professors, do they not care about teaching? But yes. Yes. Yeah. Can you say that a little bit louder?
Embrace a contract that requires some of us who are full-time, non-tenure track workers, and that will require us to teach without additional compensation.
Okay. All right. So a lot of different labels and terms, and I'm guessing at your table some of the different sorts of contracts or working conditions that you described differed quite a bit. I was just watching reactions around the table, and whenever I see surprise, that usually means there's something that's very different that you're not used to, and sometimes it's happy surprise. And I think one of the best things about coming to a group like this, like Metro WPA, is that you can share experiences from other institutions within your same area and learn from what other people have done to argue for what they have. So that can certainly be an advantage to being here. But there are a lot of different labels that we use to define these kinds of positions. And that a challenge to me, and I think to our field, is that we sometimes use umbrella terms like contingent faculty or adjunct faculty, or perhaps the most popular right now, but one of my least favorite, which is non-tenure track, because you're basically defined by what you're not, which I find particularly problematic at best, to describe all of these positions and the vastly different working conditions that you find on different campuses. And so it can be a challenge to figure out where our individual programs and job descriptions and institutions fit in. For example, for the faculty at my institution, they're full-time, they're benefits-bearing contracts, they have 1-year renewable contracts, which is something I'd be happy to talk about during the Q&A. That's not something I'm happy about right now. I'd like them to be much longer. But they are full-time, permanent positions. They can stay in them for as long as they want. But they can't figure out when they register for a conference like 4Cs, well, do I qualify as an adjunct? Do I get a reduced rate? Am I contingent? Or where do I fit within all of these different definitions? How do I label myself? And the problem is that we don't really have consistency. We use these larger terms to cover a multitude of positions that really loosely describe working conditions in our writing programs. Of course, numerous scholars have addressed concerns about working conditions in writing programs for decades. I draw a lot on the work of people like Eileen Schell and Sharon Crowley and Lester Fagley and Susan Miller and other people who have talked about these issues in ways that have been really helpful for our profession. And what I'm going to do is take kind of a brief trip through some of our professional history, specifically through the lens of looking at our professional organizations to see how these issues have been addressed in our field as a whole. And I'm just going to ask you to forgive me if I'm going over familiar territory for some of you, but I think it helps to give a common context for talking about where we are. So I'm going to go back to the 80s, and we'll start with 1987 and the Wyoming Conference Resolution. It was adopted by, I'm going to turn this so I can see what you're looking at too. It was adopted by 4Cs in 1987 in response to these growing concerns about the proliferation of adjunct faculty positions in writing programs. And the Wyoming Conference Resolution had 3 tenets to it that 4Cs adopted. The first was that 4Cs should formulate professional standards for salaries and working conditions for faculty in writing programs. Second, that 4Cs should establish a procedure for hearing grievances against cases of noncompliance. And then third, 4Cs should establish a procedure for censuring institutions in cases of noncompliance. 4Cs and the executive committee of 4Cs determined that they could act on the first tenet, and we'll talk about what grew out of that in just a minute. But the second two are kind of complicated for a variety of reasons. And much of the debate within our field centered around disagreement about this divide between non-tenure track and tenure track faculty. It would come up often that, well, some faculty might prefer not to be on the tenure track. They might not want the responsibilities of publication that often comes with tenured positions, although that often is at more research-focused institutions. Whenever that argument comes up, I like to point out that I had tenure at a community college and nobody cared if I published anything. It was completely based on my teaching. They'd give me a nice pat on the back, and sometimes a little bit like one course release for doing some research. But my tenure was entirely based on teaching performance. It had nothing to do with research. But much of the debate centered around these issues. Some faculty might choose not to be on the tenure track. And then what would be censurable? And would censure of an institution even really do anything? And would some institutions even care if they were censured? And if they did care, how might they respond to that? Some scholars in our field felt that it would be easier for administrators, university level administrators, to just do away with first-year writing instead of risking censure, or if they were censured, just get rid of the program and then that takes care of the problem. So there was some fear about how people might respond to that particular tenet if we decided to go the route of academic censure. And then there are all sorts of legal issues that are related to that too. But in response to that first tenet, 4Cs did develop in 1989 the Statement of Principles and Standards for the Post-Secondary Teaching of Writing. And this statement has far more on it than just what I have on this slide, as most of you are probably aware. And it goes through all sorts of issues related to class size and different kinds of working conditions. But the part of this that I'm particularly interested in today is the claim that they have up there that departments should rely on full-time tenured or tenure-track faculty to teach writing. So 4Cs, of course, was advocating this. However, if you read through the statement, and granted it was written 25 years ago, and it is in revision now, but in the statement as it was written and adopted in 1989, it only acknowledged 4 different kinds of teaching positions that might exist in writing programs. And those 4 positions I have listed up here: tenure line, graduate students, part-time, and then full-time temporary, which in the statement was defined with examples such as a visiting professor. But there wasn't really any provision within that statement made for full-time, permanent, non-tenure track positions, which are the kinds of positions that we're seeing in more and more programs around the country. And again, sort of a lack of differentiation between these common types of positions that is useful to us. But one of the important distinctions that 4Cs made in the statement was to argue for tenure track lines for writing faculty. And that was what, at that time in history, 4Cs decided to kind of lay its claim to. So, yet, these ambiguous terms that we're dealing with and the working conditions in our writing program still persist, 25 years later. The Associated Departments of English, the Ad Hoc Committee on Staffing, which was chaired by David Bartholomew in 2008, found that there had been a 10.7 decrease in tenure line faculty from 1993 to 2003, and then during that same decade, a 10.5% increase in non-tenure line faculty. And in public colleges and universities, 61.3% of first-year writing courses were taught by part-time or full-time non-tenure track faculty. At some institutions like mine, that percentage is even higher, of course. And much of that, I think, depends on the institutional type and the size of graduate programs and whether or not graduate programs exist. But you'll note that even in these findings here, and I should also point out the MLA in 2010 published that 60 to 80% of courses in English were taught by contingent faculty. And you'll notice that in these findings, still these slippery terms are being used. Contingent, what do we really mean by contingent? Who are we counting when we count those numbers? In its most recent documents, MLA has made, I think, great strides to clarify what is meant by non-tenure track faculty and who it is that they're counting in that and what we should be aspiring to when we're creating and advocating for better working conditions for non-tenure track faculty. But often within our own institutions, we work with these unclear terms and in these states with increasing numbers of non-tenure track faculty. And I make the argument that not only do we work in conditions where contingency is ill-defined and it still persists, but sometimes through our professional organizations, we even reward it. And this is maybe a little uncomfortable because my program is also a recipient of the 4C's Writing Program Certificate of Excellence, and I have a great deal of respect for the certificate and for the kinds of things that the certificate is advocating for. But I do want to take a quick look at the history of the 4C's Writing Program Certificate of Excellence. It recognizes, as most of you know, exemplary writing programs in our field that innovate in a variety of ways. And if you look at the list of recipients of the award, you'll see what a wide range of institutions are represented, different kinds of programs have received the award. I still remember the first year that a writing center won the award, for example. So there's a wide range of different kinds of programs that are recognized by 4Cs. And it's a prestigious award, and it is not an easy one to earn. Trust me, I wrote the application more than once. And if you've been on one of those committees where you're working on that, you know what I'm talking about. Now, I do want to be clear, the creation of the certificate is not directly related to the statement on the post-secondary teaching of writing. But I'm arguing that the certificate does serve as a sort of positive rewarding structure for programs that are kind of doing the right thing. And in some ways, it sort of stands in for the absence of a mechanism of censure. We never did think about how we would implement that or if we wanted to, so instead we're sort of going with the positive reinforcement route. We reward programs who are doing exemplary work, and then we can look to them, as many of us do, as aspirational programs when we're arguing for change in our own institutional contexts. For example, I have often pulled out information about the University of Denver, which won the award the year before we did at NC State, and I'll take that information to my dean or to my department head about how they've set up their non-tenure track faculty positions to argue for specific changes in how we structure ours. There are 9 elements that you have to have present in your program in order to be eligible for the certificate. Each point is framed in the positive. It's a list of do's instead of kind of a list of thou shalt nots. And so it's phrased as things to aspire to make sure that you have in place in your program. The third criterion of those 9 is, quote, the program treats contingent faculty respectfully, humanely, and professionally. And I do applaud that. I am glad it's there, and I certainly would not want it to be absent from the criteria by any means. However, I see a problem here. First, it assumes contingency. By having that in there and the way that it's phrased, it assumes contingent faculty are present in writing programs. They are there. We've sort of accepted this is the state of things. This is where we're at now, so let's see if we can make the best of it. It does also fail to define exactly what respectful, humane, and professional means in a consistent way. So each year, those criteria, in some regard, are left up to the selection committee to determine how to operationalize that. And in my experience, when I served on the selection committee, we often looked to the precedent that had been set by the other institutions who had won this award in the past, especially when the thorny issue of contingency came up. Well, have we given the award to other programs that rely primarily on non-tenure track faculty in their writing programs? Well, yeah, we have. Okay, so what kinds of things have we awarded? What are they doing in those programs? So the award does not explicitly offer a measure for rewarding programs who actively work to reduce contingency or to reduce reliance on part-time labor but instead rewards programs who manage it best. And this is a concern I've had because, as I said, our program won the award a couple of years ago. And while I'm very proud of winning that award, and I think there are some things we do very well in working with our contingent faculty, there are certainly things that we should do better. And there's a little part of me that wishes that I had gotten a letter from 4Cs that said, okay, you guys are doing outstanding work. Here are all the things you're doing well. However, your salary is way too low. This isn't a living wage for non-tenure track faculty, and you need to have extended contracts. You can't every year make your faculty go up for renewal so that they're always wondering whether or not their jobs are secure. But nobody said that. So we won the award, and then that's implied, our dean was thrilled with that, but it's implied then the status quo is okay. In fact, not only is it okay, it's an exemplar for other programs to look to. So I'm gonna look just a little bit at some of the other recent award winners, and I'm not going to name institutions. If you guys want to look them up, you can. And I will, in the interests of being honest, I put NC State first. I told you a little bit of the issue at NC State. We do have a massive salary differential. If you look at what our salaries are public record since we're a public institution. You can look it up online. But our salaries for our incoming tenure track faculty at the assistant professor level now are about twice what our incoming salary for a full-time lecturer in our writing program would be. And that's within the English department. I'm not even looking at the salaries in like engineering. We could just leave that out of the equation, or else it gets, the salary differential is even greater. But just within English, we have this huge salary differential between our tenure track and non-tenure track faculty. And often these non-tenure track faculty have PhDs. They have terminal degrees in their field. We do hire a lot of non-tenure track faculty who don't, but we also don't make any distinction in pay between people who have advanced degrees, like a PhD, and then people who have MAs. And then in the last couple of years, we had this wonderful extended contract scale that was set up for our lecturers. So our incoming lecturers had 1-year contracts, and then once you were promoted after 3 years after your probationary period, that was changed to a 3-year contract, and then you could go up for senior lecturer, which involves some other job responsibilities, and we had 5-year contracts for our senior lecturers. For the senior lecturers, we had rolling contracts, which meant that it was a 5-year contract, but after 4 years, you went up for renewal again and got another 5-year contract, so that it always was renewing without expiring, if that makes sense. So we were trying to keep it from ever being in the position where someone's contract expired, because that's the point at which the institution can say, okay, we have a budget crisis, we don't need to renew anybody's contracts anymore. A couple of years ago, during a time of financial crisis, upper administration decided no more, we're going to have 1-year contracts because we need the flexibility to respond to budgetary changes. I should say, no one in our program to date has ever been let go because of budgetary problems. First-year writing doesn't go away. You still have to teach it. But I've had a really hard time convincing upper administration that because of that, we should still keep those extended contracts. So that flexibility, I think, makes them feel more comfortable. So I have 2 other examples up here, and they're both salary examples that I found particularly troubling, mainly because I often am looking at salary because that's the #1 thing that I'm trying to argue for right now in my program, in addition to extended contracts. But at one school, the contingent faculty in the program, and this information I got from the Adjunct Project, if you're not familiar with the Adjunct Project, so I just looked at who had won the awards and then went on the Adjunct Project website and saw what was reported about those institutions. They were paid $2,200 to $2,800 per class with semester contracts. If you're teaching a 4-4 load or a 5-5 load, which is what I taught at the community college, you can kind of do the math and figure out what an annual salary would be. And then at the second school, the adjunct salary was reported at $2,094 per class. These just, I mean, I know these schools are not in New York City, but still, even outside of New York, that's not nearly enough for a living wage. And people are required then to be working more than 1 full-time job. And it's simply not acceptable. That status quo isn't what we should settle for. So there's a concerning precedent being set that could be addressed partly by refining the criteria for the award, although we've already given it out a lot. to schools that perhaps don't meet criteria that we would like. And there does remain kind of a missing piece in this puzzle, and I'm sort of harping on salaries and contracts and things like that, which are very important to working conditions, but there is still this tenure track, non-tenure track divide that seems to keep coming up in the literature. And what do we do about full-time, permanent, non-tenure track positions? There are a lot of schools that have worked very hard to create positions that do have equitable pay, that have very good working conditions, that are full-time, non-tenure track. So are we okay with the precedent being set by relying on those positions? And what are the working conditions that we should be advocating for to be present in institutions that want to go that route? Is tenure really all that important, I guess, is kind of what the bottom line comes down to. And we do often hear when this debate comes up, well, tenure is going away. Anyhow, tenure is eroding. Well, it hasn't. And I've been hearing that at least since I was in grad school. I'm not that old, but that argument has been around for a while, and tenure is still here. And as long as it exists, then we're dealing with these kinds of hierarchies that are really troubling and that can create problems within our writing programs. So what we have to decide is, as a profession, what really are the distinctions that we care the most about, and what should we be advocating for? Should low salary or short contract lengths be deal breakers for programs when we're giving out awards like this? Do we need clear definitions of what level of job security should be offered to faculty? Is tenure really an important part of the equation or not? So with a group of my colleagues, and I want to make sure that I acknowledge them, because some of the work that I've done on this, I've done in coordination with Casey Fedikovich and Robin Sneed and Brent Simoneau. And we wanted to look into the realities of these kinds of permanent non-tenure track positions more systematically so that we could hear the voices of the faculty and the administrators in those programs. So Brent and Robin and I conducted several interviews at one such school where the faculty are in, they have positions that we all found enviable. It was what we wanted to be able to create in our program if we have full-time non-tenure track positions. The faculty have renewable teaching track positions. They call it a parallel track to the tenure track. Their pay is equal to faculty on the tenure track. The starting salary for someone on the lecture track is the exact same as the starting salary for somebody who's on the tenure track. They have extended contracts, they have professional development funding, they have something that they call continuance, which is, and I'll show you a quotation in a minute from one of our interviewees, kind of like tenure, but not really tenure. So what we wanted to do was to respond to the research question that I've put up on the slide here. Can a parallel teaching track with extended contracts and equitable pay resolve these problematic conflicts that we see between our stated principles in the profession and our hiring practices? So we wanted to respond to that. Thus far, we've only conducted a couple of interviews, but they have started to elicit some really interesting patterns that we're seeing. And yes, this is a case study of one particular institution, but I think the patterns are kind of interesting for us to look at really quickly. And I'm just going to go through 4 of those briefly for discussion purposes. So the first was a pattern that we noticed about relationships in the department. And on these slides, what I've put up here are just some quotations that we took out of the interviews with the people that we talked to. And we talked to both people that were at the lecturer level in the program and then also administrators in the program. So related to relationships, they did say that it was more of a kind of community, that there were enough lecturer track faculty that they had hired that they had kind of created their own community focused on teaching and on the teaching of writing. The second quote here, in the larger university community here, nobody knows what track you're on. This was said by one of the lecturers that we had interviewed. And she said, really, nobody pays attention to the track that you're on because the difference in most cases is pretty negligible, that your track really doesn't matter. And they described it as a fairly supportive environment in the department, that there was a fairly supportive environment for all faculty, not just tenure track. The next trend that we noticed was about permanence, things that the interviewees were saying that were related to the permanence of those positions and how they felt about that. The conversations revealed trends about how permanence is perceived in these kinds of positions. One of the administrators described lecturers as being in an ongoing permanent position, generally with a lot of security. And he elaborated and explained that the board of the university had set a policy that the university could only be 85 to 90% tenured or tenure track and no more. And the reason for that is to maintain flexibility. So that's where I start to get concerned. Because if the reason is to maintain flexibility, then the implication there is we need to have at least 10 to 15% of our faculty somewhat expendable because they're on contracts. It was described as an ongoing permanent position that's off the tenure track. Something that sticks out to me is that although the lines are conceived of as permanent and intended to be permanent, there is still that indication that they might not be because they need flexibility in case of a financial crisis. So a little trouble in paradise perhaps. And then I had already mentioned this quote here, but one of the lecturers said, it's basically the same as tenure, it's just not as secure as tenure. And so then what that started to raise questions for me about is, what really is the purpose of tenure? What are we talking about here? If we're talking about job security, you're either secure or you're not. It's hard for me to figure out how, well, it's kind of permanent, but not quite permanent. So that was a little bit troubling to me. But after the fourth year, they are, as I had mentioned, granted continuance. So that is considered, I think, more permanent than the probationary period. A third trend that we noticed were comments that to us seemed like hopes that they had for these positions that were somewhat unrealized in reality. First, they talked about the difficulty in recruiting for these positions. They prefer to hire people with terminal degrees who have a commitment to the field and to the profession. There's a conflict between wanting to hire and recruit the best qualified teachers or faculty who are going to be part of a scholarly community, but the positions don't really offer the same stability as tenure. And there is kind of a cachet, I think, to having that tenured position still. One of the lecturers said that it gets frustrating to have to constantly defend the position or the decision to take the position. She had chosen that position because she really wanted to focus on her teaching. She had the academic credentials to have a tenure track position, but she felt like often in conversations outside of her university context, she had to defend the choice that she had made for that position. The last quotation I have on here is not actually from this study. This is something that I took from what another WPA who is at another institution with similar kinds of positions said to me in an anecdote that he shared. He had 2 faculty members come and talk to him. They had been in these permanent continuing positions for 6 to 7 years at his institution. And basically the bottom line of what they were asking him was, well, is this all there is? Like, they had been really happy there at first, and there is this wonderful scholarly community, but there wasn't the kind of opportunity for academic advancement, for professional advancement that they had really hoped for. And they were trying to figure out, okay, well, what next? What do I do next if there's not really the opportunity for promotion or for some kind of academic leadership position? I should share at the institution that we were studying, there are some other kinds of advancement opportunities available. They're eligible for sabbaticals, for example, which I think is wonderful. At the community college where I was, where our tenure was not based on research, we also had sabbaticals. And our sabbaticals had to be related, and we had to be doing some project that was related to our teaching. It didn't have to be a research project necessarily, but something that was going to ultimately end up influencing and contributing to our primary teaching responsibility. And to me, that model makes sense. And if your primary goal is teaching, there should be that opportunity for rest and for renewal and for thinking about your teaching and experiencing something that you can't do in the regular semester when you're teaching a full load. So that kind of model and that opportunity for professional development, I think, is a wonderful model to look at. Okay, a final trend that we looked at was comments that they would make comparing the 2 tracks. And some of this, I think, comes from the nature of the questions that we were asking them to, because we're asking them to think about the lecture track and the tenure track. But it doesn't seem like these were things they had not thought about before. But it did start to seem to me that if you're explicitly looking for differences between those positions, you are going to find them, and if that's what you're sort of setting out to do in the first place. One of the interviewees commented that it's impossible to really talk about the differences between these positions without othering, without starting to think of the other track as other. And othering in that sense often leads to devaluing a part of the position, whether it's NTT or tenure track, that's central to what that person is doing, depending on your perspective. So you might be devaluing the research that the tenure track faculty are focused on, or devaluing the focus on teaching that the non-tenure track faculty have. But perhaps that focus on the differences between non-tenure track and tenure track is part of our problem. Maybe our focus is too much on that binary. Perhaps if we get beyond that binary distinction and imagine something different, we can move beyond the legacy that we've been given. I found myself wondering if I was looking for differences because of my experiences that aren't really as important as they might appear to be, that there might really be a way to make this work well. But it raises for me questions about what it is that we really value in our field and what the best way is to move forward. So I am going to try to end on a positive note, I promised. So what are some of the new directions that we can go in? And it's a Venn diagram. I love Venn diagrams. But I think in this case, it actually makes sense. Because what I wanted to represent is that I think what we need to be looking for is that sweet spot where these three parts meet together. That's where we can really create the best working conditions for our writing faculty.